In the current Daf, Masechta Kidushin Daf Samachas, begin 9 lines down at the top of the Yomid, where the Gemara continues the discussion from the previous Daf. We had 4 categories we spoke about in the previous Mishnah regarding the status of the child. If it's Yesh Kidushin Ein Aveira, Yesh Kidushin Yesh Aveira, Ein Kidushin Yesh Aveira. We spoke about the last category was, the second to last category was regarding wherever there's ain't Kedushin for him, but the woman would have Kedushin for others, then the blood is mamzer. Says the Gemara will bring a source for that. How do we know that the chiva creases are those that Kedushin would not be typhus? We brought already one shot, which we're going to review in a second, and then the Gemara is going to bring a second shot, second source for how we know that a chiva creases Kedushin is not typhus, which was category number 3 of the 4 categories of our Mishnah. Shis corresponds with Kazik and Cheskel, turn to Tafachim. Shim brings today's daf. Should be a mazel tov for everyone in the mazel digashur. One thing we're discussing today's daf are kol arayis leitavs b'kedushin. That which was the third category of our Mishnah, all forbidden relationships for that person is chiva creases kedushin not typhus, and we brought one source. We're going to bring a second source. The halacha that nida tavs b'kedushin, which we already saw on the previous daf on the top of this amid. That by nida, however, Kedushin is typhus. Kedushin with women forbidden by lesser prohibitions. The Gemara is going to bring up in its conversation many different women that are lesser prohibitions, but regarding if Kedushin is typhus, regarding Yavam L'Shuk, if you allow only negative prohibitions, if I say only just a positive commandment, and how it relates to the Zayin Umois, the 7 nations of Eretz Canaan. The fourth category that we spoke about in the Mishnah, and final one, was Vlad Shivcha Benachris Kamaisa, regarding the child of a maidservant or a non-Jewish woman. Then that child has the status as the mother. We don't even consider that child as Jewish. So begin the current Daf Samachas, 9 lines down at the top of the Amud. The Mishnah had said the third category was Kal Makom She'ein La Alav Kedushin, but she would have Kedushin with others. Vlad's Mamzer, that's regarding Zeh Balachas V'Kal Arayis Shabbat Torah. That marriage with an Erev is ineffective, and the Gemara derives it from a Hekesh. That was the first pshat. He said, Ma Chayisi Yisha L'Tavas B'Kedushin, if by a chayis isha, which is his wife's sister, Kedushin is not typhus. Okay, we have av kalarai kulam leitavas b'kedushin because what's called hekesha de Rabbi Yomi, that in the pasuk when it talks about all the arayis, it ends up it says kol hashayasim kol atayivas. It says like they're all put into one category. So they're all compared to a chayis isha, but the Gemara said everyone agrees by bala nida that the vlad is not going to be mamza, although relation with a nida is punishable by karas. But nida has explicit riboy of kedushin tayfsim, but because it says v'tihi nitaz alav, v'tihi always connotes kedushin. Fil b'shas nidasa tei ba'avaya, there's going to be kedushin. Nevertheless, the Gemara said arayis makshin achayisish of living shin la nida because kula v'chumra makshin. You could compare it to achayisish, say it's asa. You could compare it to nida, say it's mutter, and therefore we pick v'chumra hekesh. That was the first source in the Gemara for how we know that the chiva creases. Kedushin not typhus. And that the Gemara brings now the second source. Of Yaakov Amar, he says Asya, we learn out other arayas that Kedushin is not typhus, that you cannot get engaged to a woman that you have an isser of an erv of creases. We learn from a Yavama, what's called Yavama L'Shuk, a woman who her husband died without any children. She's waiting for the brother-in-law. No Yibum or Chalitza was done yet. Where if she goes and marries someone else in the meantime, Kedushin does not take effect, as Rav says in Yavama Slav Yigimel Mabeis. How do you know Kedushin is not typhus by Yavama? Because it says Leisia Eishes Mesachutza, that the wife of the one who died should not have Sia, should not have Havai, which again is a wording of Kedushin to a foreigner that's not the Yavam. Okay, so I can make a Kavachaimer. If the woman that's a Yavama, that it's only a negative prohibition, not a chiv karas for her to marry someone else. Still, like Tasbek Kedushin will not take effect by that person. So if there's a death penalty or punishment of karas for such a relationship, all the more so we would say the Kedushin would not be typhus. So Gemara says, wait a second, if that's the case, so then shar chiv alavin nami, then other negative prohibitions, not just like we're saying in our Mishnah of chiv creases, even just a negative prohibition, although you cannot learn from a couple chayimers, but you should learn that from a binyan, not from mamatin, and you say, just like we find by Yavama, which is a negative prohibition, Kedushin not typhus, so to whatever is just a negative prohibition, Kedushin should not be typhus. So Nana Papa, he says, no, chiv alavim behed yiksibahu, regarding those that have a negative prohibition, not so severe as a chiv kares, the pasuk explicitly tells us that Kedushin is typhus. Where do we find this? Because the pasuk says in Devarim, pasuk says, kisiyenu leish shtei nashim. If a man is going to have two wives, ha'achas ahuva, ha'achas nua, one is the loved wife, one is the hated wife. Now the question is like this: how do you translate the pasuk? Is there a woman, a wife that's hated in front of Hashem, and one that's beloved in front of Hashem? In other words, like Rashi explained the Gemara's question, do you think the husband hating or loving one of these women would be significant in front of Hashem to have to tell us that the halacha of the inheritance will be different because of her? You would have thought it would be different. The pasuk is telling you, no, you can't make the son of the loved one to be the firstborn if really the wife of the hated one was the hated wife was the first one. I don't need to tell me that. Hashem doesn't care if you hate or love your wife. I mean, in that way at least. And to tell us Kes Habachor Yaker, I would know. Of course, it doesn't make a difference if it's the mother of the loved one or the mother that's the hated one. Ella rather must mean. How do you translate? Tais actually says, what do I mean? Maybe it means one's a tzadekis and one is a rishas, and maybe that's what it means. Hashem loves one, or one's hate in front of him, one's loved. It says no. If that would be the case, then you wouldn't have to say lo yuchel lavaker, because you think because if the mother's wicked, so her son should lose out his bechira of the nachla, so therefore that also wouldn't be an option. Ella rather, says the Gemara, must mean ahuva means ahuva ben eha, loved in her marriage, in the context of marriage. Snua means snua ben eha, meaning it's hated in front of Hashem because what happened is that you have a negative prohibition in the marriage itself. So therefore you would have thought to say that it's not a full-fledged son because it wasn't really a legitimate marriage in that way. That's what become Rahman is still the Torah saying kisiyana. That still, if there's going to be that marriage, and it's still a hated marriage because of negative prohibition, still that son is still going to get the Yerusha of the Bachar. But one thing we see is that even if you're Snub and Ehad, there's a marriage, but it's hated because Kidushin is going to be typhus. Which Gemara later is going to ask, it says, how do you know it's Machiv Alavin? Maybe it's Machiv Aseh. Maybe only when it's just a positive commandment that's being violated, which is much less than negative prohibition. How do you know you're including even Chiv Alavin? But that's what the Gemara is bringing the source. Why, even though we're learning out how we know Chiva Krisis is going to be a no Kidushin typhus, we know from a Kabachami Yivam L'Shok, so then learn out every Chiva Lavin, which is also what Yivam L'Shok is. No, because all of the Chiva Lavin, the Pasuk tells us that Kidushin is going to be typhus. But then the Gemara says, Kiva, but according to Rabbi Kiva, that he says, Mesechtes Yavamas, in Kidushin typhus and Chiva Lavin, he holds that actually Kidushin does not take effect even by negative prohibition. As the Gemara there on Daf Yomi base teaches, that if, let's say, the Yavam did Chalitza, then after Chalitza, which releases the Yavama, he did a Maimer, which is the Kedushin of Yibam. So the Rabbi Kiva says over there, no, after Chalitza, nothing's effective. In other words, the Maimer is not going to take effect, because right now, after he did Chalitza, then it's what's called Lo Yivna Oid. The Pasuk tells us that he can't rebuild anymore. Which the Gemara brings up in Daf Nun Beis and Beis, that Rebbe says that these words were only said only according to the words of Rabbi Kiva, because he makes a chalutza, which is just a loisa say of layivna, into an erva. So if you're doing maimer, which is kedushin after chalitza, you haven't done anything. But according to everyone else, it would do, because you could do kedushin with a chiva lavin. But that's what Rebbe says, that according to Rabbi Kiva, you would have done nothing. So the Gemara wants to know, according to Rabbi Kiva, the holds kedushin is not teifus b'chiva lavin. How are they going to explain this pasuk of kisiyana? What do you do? How do you translate kisiyana? What's kisiyana coming to teach me with the ahacha snua? Which snua is going to have kedushin teifus? According to Rabbi Kiva, even chiva lavin kedushin not teifus. So how's he going to translate the pasuk? Says the Gemara, he's going to translate it ba'almana l'kain gadol. When a widow gets married to a high priest, that's where kedushin is going to take effect, because the Torah reveals to us that the child's not going to be a mamzer, rather it's going to be a chalal. And generally, if kedushin is not teifus, the child's a mamzer, because it's out of wedlock. From the fact that by Malakan Gadol, we're going to explain this that in a second, that the child's not going to be a mamzer, rather a chalal. So that's how we know the Kedushin would be typhus by a Malakan Gadol. As the Gemara explains the Krib Samoy. The time in the Brisa, Rabbi Samoy says, every forbidden relationship, Rabbi Kiva would say the child is mamzer. Except when the widow gets married to a high priest. Why? That's a negative prohibition. And you told me negative prohibitions, Kidushin not typhus, the child should be a mamzer. No. The Torah says, don't get married to the amana so that it shouldn't be lo yichal. Don't desecrate your progeny, your children. Oh, what you see from there is chilulamais. The problem is you're going to make them chalalim. Not going to make mamzer because mamzer is worse than the chalalim. Why say don't make chalalim? It's going to be mamzer. Obviously, Kidushin is typhus by Malakan Gadol. But the Gemara says it's not so simple because it depends according to whom. Only Rabbi Yoshevav, the Amar that he says, Boyu Nitzavach Akiva ben Yosef. Let's go scream on Akiva ben Yosef, meaning Rabbi Akiva, who makes many psulim amongst Kalal Yisrael.
Well, he was not decreeing that was the Isa. He was saying that he was making a gezerah.
Who? Rabbi Akiva? No, he was saying that Kedushin is not going to take effect, not a gezerah.
I'm saying that all they assume that all the riots from Mamzerim, he was saying that's the Isa?
Yeah. These are drushes about how you darish in the psukim. We're middle is trying to explain that we see the Rabbanan have a source kisiyana that it says the term of Kidushin by Ben Hasunua, which we said Ben Hasunua is the one that has a negative prohibition marriage. We see Kidushin is going to be typhus. We're going to explain the second what Rabbi Kiva was going to do with that pasuk, but he doesn't have such a pasuk. So you see Yavam Lashuk, Chiv Alavin, Kidushin not typhus. Yeah, every Chiv Alav, Kidushin wouldn't be typhus. The child's going to be a mamzer. So Rabbi Kiva holds that, and that's what they're saying. They were saying let's scream on him because Shahaya Omer, he said, Kol she'en le'biyah b'Yisrael. Anytime you don't have a permitted marital relations with a woman, Havlad mamzer, the child's going to be a mamzer. So the Gemara says, wait. Would this make sense according to Rabbi Yoshevav? And that is, if he's not saying a klal, if Rabbi Yoshevav is not coming to say his own independent statement, rather, if he's coming to exclude Rabbi Samoy, who we just mentioned a second ago, we quoted Rabbi Samoy that was saying that Rabbi Kiva made a mamzer out of everything except for Amon Gadol, and that's what Rabbi Sheva was coming to respond to that and say, no. Every negative prohibition, Rabbi Kiva made a mamzer. Oh, so shaper. So it would make sense you could explain Kisiyana according to Rabbi Sheva, according to Rabbi Kiva. You're right, you wouldn't be able to explain it with Amon Gadol because that's a negative prohibition. He says that no, they're also Rabbi Kiva made a mamzer out of that. But you could still find mitzvah aseh. By Mitzri and Adaymi within 3 generations when they converted is a positive commandment that says that no, they're not supposed to. You're not supposed to get married to a Jew then. It says Der Shlishi Yahweh, only 3rd generation converts and not 2nd generation. Which that's how you would explain Ben Asnua, that Snua ben Isu Eha, where the Kedushin would be typhus, would be referring to Chiva Aseh. And that's how we would explain, according to Rabbi Kiva in Rabbi Sheva's version. The only problem is Ella Itaima Dinavshe Kamar. But if Rabbi Sheva was saying his own statement, he was making a klal, and he wasn't going just to disagree with Samoy. He was coming to tell us, no, any time there's a biyah that's usher, the child's going to be a mamzer. So then the problem is, that sounds like Vafila Chiv Aseh. Even if it's prohibited only on the virtue of a positive commandment. So b'may mukamla, what is he going to explain the pasuk of Kisiyana, which including a Havaya, a Kidushin for Ben Asnua of a hated marriage, which case is that Tolma? Where are you finding Kidushin being typhus according to Rabbi Kiva if every single time it's forbidden biyah, it's going to be a mamzer? That means Kidushin not going to be typhus. Says the Gemara, Bebe'ula kan gadol. You could have the case by a woman who's not a virgin anymore to marry a high priest, where that's a positive commandment, and the pasuk says Isha b'psuleha yikach, that the kohen has to marry a woman that has her virginity, and not a be'ula, which is what's called a lava baba chala say. A negative prohibition derived from Pama's commandment has the status of the positive commandment. Now Rashi says, wait a second, that makes her into either a zaina or a mana or a grusha. How'd she become a ba'ula? I mean, she had biyah with someone. It means either she had promiscuous behavior, she became a zaina, or she must have been married to a widow or grusha. Anyway, she's been into the kohen gadol. Says Rashi, no, a ba'ula that's a penuya, a single girl that had biyah, is not a zaina, as the Mishnah teaches in Divamis of Samachal from Alf. A zayin is only a giyaris or meshachreris that had bias nus and a bia from someone that's usher to her that invalidates her. But a regular single girl who had relations does not make her a zayna. Now the Bach actually adds on to the words in Rashi. He says, and even according to Rabbi Eliezer, holds that it does make her a zayna, even when she's a single woman. You could find the case of Ba'ula by Mama Enes. That's what the Gemara explains the Yavamas of the Testament base. A single 8-year-old girl who is married, who had beer with her husband, and then there's me and refuses and walks off. She's not a zayna, not a mana, not a grusha, and she's a Ba'ula. So okay, so they're fine. That's the case where it's just a positive commandment of Ba'ula Kan Gadol. That's where Kidushin can be tafer. So the Gemara says, Maishna. What's the difference, this assay, from let's say the assay of Mitzri and Adaimi, where we say that Kidushin would not be taifers, and there would be a mamzer. Why is Ba'ula Kan Gadol any different? Says the Gemara, I'll tell you why. Because it's not a universal positive commandment. It's only by one person in the world that has this mitzvah, the Kan Gadol. No one else has a mitzvah to marry a virgin. And therefore, it's a lesser type of an isser. Therefore, that's what we would include from this ribuy of kisiyana leish de nashim ha'achasanua, which is the hated woman, would be if a Kohen Gadol marries a Ba'ula. That's where Kidushin is going to be taifas. But according to Rabbi Shevav's version of Rabbi Kiva, no other prohibited woman Kidushin would be taifas. It would always not be, and therefore the child would be a mamzer, according to Rabbi Kiva, according to that version. But then the Gemara says, back to the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan that we had explained that how do they translate kisiyana? They learned it for the source for chiva lavin, like the Tan of our Mishnah, who only said chiva creases Kidushin is not taifas and the child's going to be mamzer. But just a negative prohibition. There, you're telling me that that's what we're learning from the pasuk. The problem is, since you could learn that from Yavam L'Shuk, as we said, from a Mamatzino, which Yavam L'Shuk is just a negative prohibition, and you told me Kidushin is not taifas. So the question is like this: a demuki law b'chiv alav, instead of explaining the word kisiyana, that Kidushin is taking effect by the hated wife, by negative prohibition, why are you saying such a big chiddush? Why don't you say it only nukma b'chiv asay? Say it by a positive commandment, because negative prohibitions you'd rather learn out from Yavam L'Shuk that says Kidushin is not taifas. Says the Gemara, it can't be. I'll tell you why. Why not? Because hanachiv asay b'mayninu. This that you're telling me that you want to include from kisiyana a positive commandment, what case would that be talking about? Why? What's the problem? I'll tell you why. Ishtein mitzriyos. If the two wives, right? You're telling me there's a pasuk that says kisiyana leish shtei nashim. One is ahuva and one is snua. So you're telling me that Kidushin is taking effect by the snua. So let me. What are these two wives? If they're both Egyptian wives, let's say within 3 generations when you're not supposed to marry them, then shtein snuas, right? Obviously, then they're both hated because you're not supposed to marry them. They're not 3rd generation converts yet. So what are you going to say? Very simply, say no. The loved one is the regular Jewish wife, and the hated one is the Egyptian 1st or 2nd generation convert. Problem is, says the Gemara, shtei nashim am echad beinan. If you're saying two shtei nashim sounds like from the same nation. That's how the Gemara understands it. Shtei nashim, 2 wives. It sounds like from the same people, but it's not. If one's a Jewish one, one's Egyptian, it's not the same people. And gadol. And if you're going to say that, no, like we explained before, that the hated one will be a Bulukan Gadol, and they're both Jewish wives, but Miksiv Siena Lakayan, does it Kisiena? It doesn't say Lakayan, it says Kisiena Laish. Why it should say Lakayan, it's not just any person. So therefore, says the Gemara, therefore the Rabbanan by default felt it has to be Tumah Chiv Lavin, because really there's no case you could have explained it in Chivasei or Bulukan Gadol. It doesn't make sense in the interpretation of the pasuk, and therefore they're including a ribuy, which is interesting, like your question, how do we know that Chiv Lavin, Kidushin is taifas? We know it only by default because we couldn't explain it any other way, what Kisiyana of the Ben Asnu is coming to include, and if it's included in Chiv Lavin. But Rabbi Kiva, it's interesting, like you're saying, how we know that he's going to hold all these children mamzerim. It's simply because Bal Karchach Shavke Lekra. By default, you have to leave the pasuk because the dachik, it's anyways pressed, umuki anavshe, and you leave it for itself. Meaning, as Rashi explains, what is the Gemara trying to say? Since the pasuk is revealing to you by Yavama, the Kiddush is not going to take effect, we should learn out from there that Chiv Lavin, there is no Kiddush. So therefore, the children are going to be mamzer. Now, what do you do with Chisiyana? Then you have to say it's Tomah Chiv Aseh. and let's say, yeah, one of them is Egyptian and one of them is not. Or according to Bishevav, you'd have to explain it by Bulaka and Gadol. It doesn't say Kisan Lakoyan, it says Kisan Lish. Yeah, Adoichik. There's no, you can't say it's referring to Chibalam like Rabbanan because Yavam Lashuk already tells us Kidushin Taifis by Kidushin not Taifis by Chibalavin. So we're gonna make a Mamatzinu. Each one is saying a different logic why I don't like what you're saying because they're both Doichik. But Rabbi Kiva is saying that the pasuk is a Doichik, so you'll have to explain that. Yes, let's say Yavam Kan Gadol, Be'ula Kan Gadol, or Chiva say because I find Chiva Lavin already Kidushin not Taifis by Yavam Lashuk. And the Rabban is saying that no, that the pasuk cannot be talking about those cases. It must be the Machiv Lavan, and therefore you have to say that you don't have a Mamatzinu from Yavam Lashon.
Why and how did the Echad and not let it be an emotional thing? He married her. Why is it mashma she could be?
Right, because that's what the Gemara was saying, that there's no reason why the Torah would have to tell us the halacha of b'chayr, that it goes to the son of the hated one if it really means an emotional thing.
You're saying that it
has to be that it's hated in front of Hashem. And what's hated in front of Hashem? That the marriage was in sin. What type of sin? We know Chiba Krisis Kedushin is not even there. It's not even a marriage in sin. It's not a marriage. So there must be a marriage that's in sin that's being recognized that it's a marriage even though it's in sin. Which one is that? That's the Gemara's discussion. Is that Chiva Lavin, or is that only Chiva Aseh, or is that only Be'ula, L'Kayin Gadol? Now, we finished that third category. Now the Gemara moves on, because we brought two sources for how we know that Chiva Krisis, at least for sure, Kidushin is not Taifis. Now we move on to the fourth and final category of the Mishnah. We said, any woman that cannot marry any Yisrael, not this man and not any other man. So that the Mishnah said, Havlad Kamaisa. The child is going to be like her. On that the Mishnah said, and what case is that? If a man, Jewish man, marries a maidservant, a non-Jewish maidservant, or a non-Jewish woman, the halach is it's not even his child. We view it as if it's non-Jewish as the mother. So the Gemara says, Shifcha Kanan's Minalan. Where do we know that the non-Jewish maidservant, that Kedushin is not going to take effect with that maidservant? Some of the Rabbi says, because Amakar the Pasuk is in Bereshis. This is when Hashem, this is when he's talking to Yishmael and Eliezer. Shvu lechem payim achamar. He says, stay here with the donkey, and me and Yitzchak are going to go up and do that keder. So what's this that about Eliezer? Eliezer was from Canaan. To say because am hadoim al chamar, im achamar, it could be am achamar. It's stay here with the donkey, which refers to Eliezer, because it's the people that's similar to a donkey. Meaning Canaanim have halacha, and that's why we always call Eved Canaani, because of the subjugation that's Noach, and this is Parsha Kurs Canaan, Eved Yilami, that he's going to be the slave. So we call it Eved Canaani. That it's a people that's similar to a donkey. So obviously that, like the Gemara says, Ashkechan Deloitavse Bekedushi. So you obviously cannot get married to a donkey. So we find that Kedushin is not Tevis because it's compared to a donkey. But now the second half of the question, as it continues to the base, but how do you know that the child will be like the mother? That's the non-Jewish woman, a Jewish man marrying a non-Jewish woman. The child's not Jewish. The child's going to be like the mother. How do we know by Shifcha that that's the case? Because the pasuk says in Shemais, it says Isha viladeha atil adeneha. The pasuk is talking about by a non-Jewish maidservant that's designated for the Eved Ivri, for the Jewish slave, which the Torah allows that relationship. But the pasuk says that the son will not go free when the father leaves the Eved Ivri. It's the woman with her children that will be for her master. So we see that when you marry a Shivcha Kananis, the children are considered as Avadim and not as Jewish men. Okay, that's half of the equation. That's regarding the Shivcha. Now the other half of the halacha, Nachris Minalan. How do we know the halacha by a non-Jewish woman? A regular non-Jewish woman, he meets in college, he gets married to the Jewish man. How do we know that Kedushin, first of all, is not going to take effect, and it's going to go after the mother, the paternity? So Amakra, the maternity. Amakra, the pasuk says in Dvarim, it says, Loitis chatin ba. You should not have any halacha of marriage with the non-Jewish people. It says, okay, okay, we find that obviously Kedushin is not taking effect. That's one half of the equation. Well, chiva krisis also could just not take effect, and doesn't mean the child's not Jewish. It's just, let's say, a mamzer or whatever. It's not. How do we know the child takes on the status of the mother and is to be considered as not Jewish? So on that, Mishum ben Yochi says, the pasuk says after that, meaning it first says, there's a little bit of a finer point, Talat Kab. It says, Bitcho leisitin lebnoi. This is actually talking about by the Shiva Umas, which we're going to explain in a second. How do we know for every non-Jewish person? But it's talking about the prohibition of intermarriage with the non-Jews. So it says, Bitcho leisitin lebnoi. It says, your daughter don't give to his son. And his son, don't take for your daughter. Basically, don't let your daughters and sons marry their daughter and sons. But what does it say after that? It follows through and it says like this. And so you have to. It's a finer point. Ki yasser es bincha me'acharei. Why should you not intermarry? It says Hashem, because Yasir, he will remove your son from after me. So Rashi explains. It doesn't say ki yasser es bitcha, which it should have said. It should have said, don't let your daughter marry him, because he, that non-Jew, will turn your daughter away from me. It doesn't say that. It says, because he will turn your son. There's not two men getting married. Who are we talking about? Who's he will remove your son? So Rashi explains, it sounds like we're talking about the son that's born from the non-Jewish father with your daughter. And that's what the pasuk is saying, that the non-Jewish father will remove your son. He's not having no Hanukkah over there. He's having some other things there in his house on different holidays. He's going to remove your son, that's meaning the grandson. So what we see from there is that bincha bo Yisraelis, your son that comes from a Jewish woman, meaning the son of your daughter, even from a non-Jew, that's kar bincha. That's called your son. But ve'in bincha haba, that's why, because it's removing your son, because it was your daughter, so your grandson is your son. But ve'in bincha haba kar bincha. And the Machlokes Rashi Teis how it explains. We're going to go Rashi Teis has all different cheshbon how to explain this. But it's not going to be the case of your son that's born from the non-Jewish woman. That's not going to be considered as your son. How do we know that? So Rashi explains. It doesn't also say kisasser es bincha. It doesn't say she will remove your son, which that we would understand to mean that the pasuk was also particular that on the case of bitoy lesikach levanecha, that by his daughter, the non-Jewish guy's daughter, you shouldn't take for your son because of kisasser, because the non-Jewish mother is gonna remove the son that's born to her from your son. It doesn't say that. Why not? Because obviously the son of the non-Jewish woman is not called your son anymore. Ela b'na. Exactly. That's why. There's no more kisasser. Not going to remove him from Judaism. He's not Jew. Yeah, okay, that's what Taisa has a whole conversation about actual marriage itself. But Rashi explains it. No, we're talking about the concern when they're going to have a child, and then the child's he's going to go to public school in the morning. He goes to Hebrew school in the afternoon. Then he goes to some other denomination, whatever. He's going to be removed from Judaism. That we don't tell you in the case of when your son marries his daughter. We don't talk about that. We only talk about when your daughter marries his son. Why? Because we're only concerned when your daughter marries his son, because then he's Jewish. So we're concerned, don't do such an intermarriage, because guess what? Your Jewish grandson is not going to know he's Jewish. He's going to grow up not Jewish. But we don't even tell you in the case of when your son marries the non-Jew's daughter that, be careful because she might remove your grandson from Judaism. No, he's not Jewish. So we don't have to tell you he's susser. So Rashi says, it's not like explicitly from the pasuk that it says that we're knowing this idea. We're just telling you from the fact that the pasuk was not particular to talk about the son that's born from her. Obviously, your son that's born from the Jewish woman is called your son, but the son born from the non-Jewish woman is not called your son, and that's the source for how we know that the vlada is kamaisa, that the child is like her, because The child's not even Jewish. This is the right. Right. So that we're going to see later on about, let's say, Reb Shimon's Dorish time of the Kra, that why are we telling you a reasoning for it? Right.
What's the
Right.
status of such a marriage, and is she subject to Ashes Ish if she's married to a non-Jewish man?
The Jewish woman.
Yeah, if she's living with a
So we're saying Kidushin is not taifus
on
this marriage.
right?
That we said, and then we're saying also that the child is going to take on the status of the mother. That's actually the next point we're saying. Amar Ravina, he says Shema Mina, and Taisa asks on this, what's the Shema Mina? It seems very implicit. That's why he says a different pshat. But we see from this, from the fact that you're calling the son of the Jewish woman that's born from the not Jewish dad, we're going to call it bincha, and that's what we're considering. Yasser, he, the not Jewish dad, is going to remove your son from your daughter, who is Jewish, away from your religion, which is Jewish. So we can infer that ben bitcha, habam and oivikachav mkar bincha, which really seems redundant. That's today's question on Rashi. But basically, the son of your daughter that comes from a not Jewish dad is going to be considered as your son. Basically, the kid is Jewish in that type of situation. So that's what Ravina says. So the Gemara says, wait, Nemiksa Ravina, shall we say Ravina holds, Oivid Kechavim, this is the case you're asking, the not Jewish man, the Eved or a slave, Haba Bas Yisrael, that has relations with a Jewish woman, is that to say Havlad Mamzer? Very interesting question, what the Gemara wants to say on Ravina. Meaning, what's Ravina coming to say, which sounds like Rashi's answering today's question? Ravina is coming to tell us that we're not going to give the paternity of this child based on his not Jewish father, because actually it would be a leniency. Why would that be a leniency? Because if the father's not Jewish, that means, meaning if we based it based on the father, if we went after the father, that means the child would also be not Jewish. Then if the child converts, he's a regular Jew. He's allowed to marry whoever he wants to. It sounds like what Ravina is trying to say is that, no, we go based on the mother. Now, since the baby was born in sin, because the mother was with a not Jewish man, that makes him a Yisrael that's puzzle, like all of those that are born from those that don't have Kidushin, which the Mishnah taught on Daf Samach Vav base, that they're mamzerim. So you're actually worse off. You're worse off in the way that you're going based on the mother who's Jewish, because now the child's a mamzer. If you went based on the father, the child would be not Jewish, and he could convert, and he can marry whoever he wants to. So is that to say what Ravina is trying to tell us? That the child's going to be a mamzer? Because isn't that what he's saying when he's saying going based on the Israelis? In the Chanami, that's what Taisa seems to ask on the interpretation of Rashi. It seems like implicit, and that's what he's saying over there too. That's Taisa's question. Taisa give us a different interpretation. But Ravina seems to be following through on that principle, and therefore he's saying, and what are you trying to say? Because Rabbi Shloimy Schwartzberg doesn't say it really so explicitly, but yeah, it seems to be implicit. So the Gemara answers and says, no, not true. From here you can't learn out anything about mamzeris. It's not true. Because Nihida Kashala, you're right, although based on what Ravina is saying, that we're going based on the mother, that the child's born in sin, so obviously it's not going to be a regular kosher child, but mamzer lehava, but we wouldn't necessarily infer that the child's going to be a mamzer, as the Gemara says in Yavamas of Meim and Beis. Where do we know the law of mamzeris from? We learn it out from Eshes Aviv, from a man who has relations with his father's wife. Now, just like a father's wife, where there's no Kidushin, but there is Kidushin for that woman with some other Jewish man, the Torah tells us that the child's going to be a mamzer, because right after it talks about lo yigala kanaf aviv, with the prohibition of marrying the father's wife, it says lo yava mamzer, which teaches us that that's what creates a mamzer. So to anything that the woman would not have Kidushin with this man, but she would have Kidushin with another man, that excludes a non-Jewish man who there's no Kidushin for her at all. So that's when we say that it's going to create a mamzer. So here, it's meaning to say that, to the contrary, mamzer is when it would be a marriage, let's say a regular chiba krisis, one of the arayis relatives or whatever. So that would be creating a mamzer. But a non-Jewish man who there would never be any relationships with them with any Jewish woman, that we would say that wouldn't create a mamzer. It's only psul mikri. What? Even according to Rabbi Kiva, yeah, that's what we would say that chayra. Rabbi Kiva is just saying it's a question how you translate what Rabbi Kiva's statement is when it says kosher leheter bia. You have to know how you translate that, but could be, and we're saying that it would be called a puzzle, like all of those that are born in sin from a chiva lav and a chiva say, which this would not be like Rabbi Kiva, Rashi explaining it, which they wouldn't be mamzerim. But at least according to Rabbanan, for sure, that not necessarily Ravina is saying that if they're not Jewish father and a Jewish mother, the child would be a mamzer. Could be that it would be considered as a puzzle, even though obviously that Kidushin is not taifis. In general, Kidushin is not taifis. You say the child's a mamzer. Well, that's because it's not taifis with this person, but it would be taifis with another person. But a non-Jew has no Kidushin at all. So maybe there I would say that actually the child would not be a mamzer. It would be a puzzle, but it wouldn't be a mamzer. Okay, fine. That's the source for the halacha of how do you know a not Jewish woman that Kedushin is not taifis and the child takes on the status of her. But the Gemara says, wait a second. Hahu, the source that you brought up until now of loitis chatin bam, that tells us that there's no Kedushin taifis. And v'chiyasser, which teaches us that the child takes on the status of the mother. That's b'shiva goyim. That's by the 7 nations of Eretz Yisrael that the pasuk is written, which that would teach us regarding them. But shar umas menalan, how do we know regarding halacha of other nations of the world that they would have the same halacha? So Amakra, the pasuk says ki yaser es bintcha. It says, and this is where it comes a little bit to the question that you asked before regarding why it says the reasoning of the prohibition, what a 50-year-old woman would not have. No, it says, because he's going to remove your son, l'rabbis kol hamasim, to include all nations that are going to remove your sons, not only the 7 nations. Now, says Gemara, wait a second, that's not such a great answer. Because hanich Rabbi Shimon, the Torah's time of the Kura, that makes sense according to Rabbi Shimon, that he expounds the rationale, the reasonings of the pasuk. What does that mean? So the Gemara B'Metzidav Kaftes Vav Merav brings, let's say, regarding a widow. The Torah tells us that you're not supposed to take a collateral security from a widow. Rabbi Shimon says, from a wealthy woman you could take security, a poor woman you cannot. He says, what's the reason why the Torah tells you don't take security, the garment of a widow? It says, I'll tell you the reasoning of the Torah. Because you're going to have to give her security back in the evening. And because of that, you're always going to be coming and going to this widow who lives by herself in the morning to take the collateral, in the evening to return it. Suddenly she's going to start getting a bad reputation amongst her neighbors, saying, I wonder what's happening with Mr. H and Mrs. Z, that they keep on having this. And so therefore, he could also say the same drasha, that what's the reason why the Torah says you should not intermarry? Rabbi Shimon would have told you the reason is, well, obviously, because it's going to, although the child's going to be Jewish, but the not Jewish father is going to remove your child from Judaism. And the Torah did not have to say the reason. Why did it say he always darshans the time of the Krah? Why here did the Torah tell you a reason? Oh, that's extra, the word kiyaser. Oh, kiyaser is extra to tell me l'rab shar umais that I'm asirim, and therefore it's extra. But let Rabban, according to Rabbanan, then that means to say you need the pasuk to explain the reasoning of the 7 nations themselves. To the contrary, it's actually excluding other nations who are not so attached to idolatry like the 7 nations, as the Gemara tells in Chol Nav Yigimon Beis. The Umais in Chutz La'aretz, they don't really do idolatry. They're also minhag avosem b'yadayim. You think we only keep our minhagim? They're also the same minhagim, and therefore it wouldn't be extra to teach me a ribui, because to the contrary, it actually would be there specifically to tell me it's only by the 7 nations and not by the other nations. So my time, according to them, how do you know that there's a prohibition of marrying, or that the status will take on the status of the mother when it's some other nation? Which, as the Gemara similarly says in Sanhedrin of Chavav and Aleph, when the Torah tells that lo yarba nashim, the king is not allowed to increase his wives, and therefore lo yasel levava, it shouldn't remove his heart. According to Rabbi Shimon, that lo yaser is extra, because without explaining the pasuk, he would have darshan the reasoning from itself. According to Rabbanan, who don't darshan time the kra, here the pasuk says explicitly the reason, and the Gemara discusses the same thing also over there. So over here, the Gemara is asking, well, this extra of ki yaser is only extra according to Rabbi Shimon, and that's how you would know all the other nations. According to Rabbanan, what's the reason that we know by the other nations too? So that's the Gemara Makra, a different source, because it says the pasuk in Devarim, the achar kain, after that the woman remained by you, as according to the decree of the Torah, that permitted for you to take the beautiful maiden, which was that when you were conquering the nations of the that you were conquering, the Torah tells us, okay, after she went through the whole procedure of the Yifas Tayar, then you could come to her and you could be with her, etc. And the Torah says v'haisa, which the word v'haisa connotes havaya. Oh, but machlal, the inference is the mikara that before you went through the whole procedure of the Yifas Tayar, we wouldn't say v'haisa. That obviously tells us the Kidushin, that Kidushin would not take effect. Now, Rashi explained, some Girsayis actually have added words here on the margin, that pasuk is told by other nations of the world, because the Torah tells us over there in Devarim Chafal, you'll take captives. By the 7 nations, it says lo yisechai kol neshama. You're not allowed to leave any of them alive. Rashi ala Torah. Yeah, but how does he know that? That's what they're proving over here, that he knows it because it says b'shavisa shivya. Because it was mechamas mitzvah, then you wouldn't be able to take out. You wouldn't be able to keep any of them alive. So it's some of the other umays, and that's how we know that Kidushin not taifus, because it's only after the procedure of the Yifas Tayar that it's taifus. Before then, it would not be taifus. Okay, says Gemara, that's only half the equation. Ashkechan delay tavs b'Kidushin. So I know the source of Kidushin then does not take effect. But regarding other nations, other nationalities, Vlad b'Kamaisim, how do we know that the child takes on the status of the mother and is not Jewish? Because Amakra, the pasuk says later on, says Kisiyana le'ish, then it's going to be for a man, the Yolduloi, and it's going to be born to him, which means it takes on the status, the Yichus after the father. What do we learn from this pasuk? Wherever we recite regarding it, Kisiyana, that there is Kidushin, that's what Havai always connotes. Then we recite, the Yolduloi is born to him. Wherever we don't say Kisiyana, meaning when Kiddush is not taifis, which is we just proved by other ummahs is not taifis, like Karina, baby Yolduloi, then we don't say that's born to him, rather it's born to her, because it takes on the yichus of the mother, and the child is going to be considered not Jewish. So Gemara says, wait a second, that's a great source. Then a maidservant also, we should know that the child's like her from this pasuk, because there's no Kisiyana, because it already said imachamar amadem elachamar. So why do we bring a different source for shivcha? How we know that the vlad is like her from the top line of this amid? I don't need that pasuk anymore. The Gemara says in the Chanami, you're right. You really know it from this pasuk of Kisiyana l'ishviel doloi, which is only considered on the father if there's kedushin, but like by shivcha there's no kedushin, it would take after her. So then Ella, the question is, then what do I need the pasuk of that the woman and her children are to the master? It's obviously not coming to teach us that the vlad are like her, because that we know from Kisiyana le'ishviel doloi. So Gemara says, you're right, look at time, that's teaching us something else that we learned in our Braises. If someone says to his maid servant that's pregnant, says, surely you're a free woman. He gives her a get shichur, but he says, but I want this to continue our relationship. I want your child that's now in your womb to remain an eved. So the halacha is havlad kemaisa diver basically says no, her child is like her and is emancipated, as the sefer there teaches, because meaning as we're going to quote in a second, it says isha viladeha tila doineha. It says the woman and her children belong to the master, meaning when the woman belongs to the master, then the child goes after to the master too. But if the woman's not to the master because she's being freed, then her child that's born does not go to the master either. And that's why we needed the pasuk to teach us for this halacha, but nothing to do with that the yichus that we know from somewhere else. It's teaching this unique case, even when he frees her and wants to keep the slave, no, the slave is going to go free to her child. Actually, they disagree. They say no, dvarv kayamim. his words are valid. And yes, the woman will go free, but the baby that's going to be born is going to remain his slave. Because it says in the pasuk we wrote before, the woman and her children tila did not belong to the master. Where it says, I don't understand my Talmuda. How do the Rabban learn from this pasuk that his words are valid and that the woman will go free, but the children remain slaves? Doesn't this pasuk seem to contradict? Amaravi says, yeah, the pasuk is actually going back on Rabbi Yisrael Glili. This pasuk was Rabbi Yisrael Glili saying it. Rabbi Yisrael Glili said that when he emancipates the slave woman, but he wants to keep the slave child, that no, the child is like her and goes free with her, that he brought the source of Isha. They're both the same, the mother and child. But the Chacham, it doesn't explain the reason why they disagree, but they disagree and they say that's not the source from this pasuk. That's what we do with the pasuk, because we don't need it to teach it. Lord the Kamaisik, because that we know from the pasuk of Kisiyan al-Ish, behold the life, anytime. Those things.